We're celebrating our 50th anniversary, Lee and I, and everyone could come to vacation in the Black Hills. Our first stop has been in the beautiful Badlands of South Dakota. This is an area that our great Grandma Pink, she and her husband John Ellis settled in the first part of the century. So this is part of our history. Her name was Maggie McDonald, and she had tuberculosis. And so she and her young husband were told that her health would improve if she moved to a dry area. So they homesteaded in Belvedere, which is not far from the area that you're now observing. I can remember her stories about settling. They built the first house in Belvedere, and they hauled lumber from Murdo, I think. She and her horse Billy were on the prairie a lot, and they would camp. I imagine that her husband was working on the house while she hauled the lumber in a wagon. And then they would camp on the prairie, and she would always put a rope around their campsite. And my sisters, Sherry, Cindy, and I would always say, "Grandma, why did you put a rope around your campsite?" And she said, "That's because the rattlesnakes wouldn't crawl over it, because it tickled their bellies." And we loved that story.
One of the favorite attractions in the Black Hills is Bear Country, where you have the chance to see animals in their natural habitat roaming free, which is really exciting for Morgan and Vania and Kate. And I think that the Alex, Oliver, and Ethan liked it as well. It was a very hot day, so it was going to take a while to get through, like 2 or 3 times as long as normal. But we did see a lot of bears, and you'll see some of them come right up to the car. They look right in at you like, maybe you'd taste good, maybe you wouldn't. And you get to see them playing in the water, climbing on trees, and doing what bears do. When we were on a little canoe trip with friends of ours, Kyle and Carrie and I were camping in a pasture, which apparently was inhabited not by bears, but by livestock, cows specifically. And during the night, I don't know for sure if a cow did come close to the tent, but I thought it did, and I attacked it to get rid of it. And actually, I was attacking Kyle, and he's never forgotten or forgiven. But he survived it, and the cow went away if it was there. And we continued on the next day down the James River into the wind and no current at all. So eventually, Karen had to rescue us before we never did make it to Forestburg from Huron. Custer State Park, there's a wildlife loop of about 20 miles, and hopefully on those 20 miles you'll encounter part of the 2,000 plus herd of American bison, often called buffalo. In 1978, we had a brown Honda station wagon that must have resembled a great big bison bull, because we encountered the herd. They were thick on the road, and they must have thought we were one of them, because they just crowded in around us and looked in the windows and just acted like we were part of the buffalo herd. And eventually we were able to get away, but it took quite a while. And that was kind of the case this year too, because the buffalo are in their native land and they're grazing and they don't care about the cars. So it's dangerous for you to get out of the car, but sometimes our more creative people stick their heads up out of the sunroof, and you'll see maybe Morgan and Vania doing that. And then you'll see a little game going on that leads to a story about another road trip. And that's kind of the saga of being in the Colorado mountains, visiting a homestead, walking back. Carrie got into the van and sat down in one of the captain's chairs, which was designated for Karen and Barb. And I told her that she couldn't sit there, so she, unknown to me, got out of the van and went and sat on the back bumper. So everybody else got in the van, we closed the doors, and when I went to back up, she decided that that wasn't a safe place to be, so she must have moved. I didn't see her, and away we went. And we went that way for a good 25 minutes or more, and Jamie said, "Aunt Karen, can I play a game with Carrie in the back?" So he went, sure, he could do that. So he went back there, and then pretty soon he's going, Aunt Carrie, Carrie's not in the back. So we quickly figured out that she was nowhere in the van, and we did a 180 in pretty rapid fashion and headed back down the mountain trail. And when we got to the homestead, it had been about, I don't know if it was close to an hour or whatever, but Karen said that she probably would be crying uncontrollably, and Kyle knew better and said she'll be really mad. And when we pulled in, she made a fist and shook it at us, and then she got in the van, and then she cried a bit.
We're on an adventure to Wind Cave. This is a cave that Lee and I visited early in our marriage, and it's one that we've always loved. During the tour, the guide always gets you into a big area after climbing tons of steps and going through narrow passageways. And you get in this big room, and she says, "Now, has anyone ever been in the dark?" And of course, everyone has. But she lets us know that we're going to experience real darkness. So she completely turns off all the lights, and you cannot see anything, not even your hand in front of your face. Well, then now she's ready to turn the light on. The guide wants to show us what it's like in days gone by when they just explored with one single candle. And she wants to light this so we can see what it's like. And she says, she tries to do it and nothing happens. She tries several times to get it lit. And then she says, "Is there anyone here that would have a match?" And we're all thinking, who would even carry matches anymore? Lee pops up, sticks his hand in his pocket, and has a huge box of matches and gives the guide the matches to light the candle. And then we get a round of clapping and shouts of hurrah.
Several years ago, when we were touring with Bob and Margaret and their family, Bob and I got a little bit left behind, and guide turned the lights out as they went to the elevator, and Bob and I found out that it's darker than the inside of a cow. At the end of the wildlife loop, we come to the State Game Lodge, which was Calvin Coolidge's summer home when he was president, a never since or ever before occurrence for the state of South Dakota to have the President of the United States be there in the summer. It now has very fine dining, and it's a great place to stay, which we didn't do, but we did stop to eat. And they have very unique items on their menu, and it was unanimously named as the #1 dining experience of the trip of 2018. So hopefully we created a memory there. Karen and I elected to pass on the helicopter flight since we've done that in Hawaii and other places. And kids certainly were excited to take that opportunity. I remember when I was in pilot training, when we were in the T-38, you start out after 6 months of other training, learning a little bit of formation flight. And in one of the formation training flights of 4-ship, Sammy Smith was my instructor, and he thought that my overtake speed was too great, probably about 100 knots, and I was sliding in on the wing on the star reference pretty quickly. So he did a little bit of a barrel roll. I had a similar thought, whoa, I'm getting in here too quick. So I did a little barrel roll to the right. His was to the left. We came out at the bottom right in formation. And both were quite amazed, and a little bit of extra perspiration probably. One of my other mates at Vance Air Force Base was not quite as fortunate. The student that was doing the rejoin on his airplane cut off the whole front end of the airplane so that there was no battery left. He couldn't get a restart. The plane wouldn't fly. He had to eject. The other plane had a very damaged elevator, but it did manage to land safely, and everyone survived it. But it was a great reminder of how critical formation flying is. And when you see the Blue Angels or the Thunderbirds, what they're doing close to the ground is what every military pilot does at 20,000 feet in training. The F-100 that I flew out of Sioux Falls, we did a lot of low level training, and we would take off and head south for just a little bit, turn, go over Madison and up towards Huron. And it was always hard to believe that I could be in Huron in 8 minutes, but it would always take us over 2 hours to make the drive. And that's what Karen got a little tired of when I was in training, that you can fly someplace a lot faster than you can drive it. And the 114th and 175th Tactical Fighter Squadron has taken a number of photos of A-7s, F-100s, 4-ships above Mount Rushmore. And it's a pretty impressive photo. And low-level flying in that kind of environment is particularly challenging in a high-performance jet aircraft, much safer in a helicopter. But even in a helicopter, the area that they could cover in 15 minutes would take you hours and hours to drive if you were on the state, the Iron Mountain Highway or Needles Highway, or going past Mount Rushmore. It's incredible, and it's another unique view of the world because you see the formations from the top. And I'll never forget the first time that I did a low-level flight over Mount Lemmon, which is outside of Tucson, and it just kept getting closer and closer and closer to me, and I kept pulling up and pulling up and pulling up, and when you're at 5,000 or 8,000 feet, going about 400 knots, the ground comes up pretty quickly, and we probably would get down sometimes to 50 feet before you'd get that nose up over the top of the mountain. And we managed to do that every time. We were lucky, I guess. Never had to eject. Had several in-flight emergencies. Probably the most critical, and I had one instance. I was flying an F-100C in Tucson, and for some reason I was, I think, number 4 in a flight, and we were getting jockeyed around in the air, and I was running low on fuel. And by the time I got landed and taxied in and parked, it was out of fuel. And it takes 900 pounds to make one go around. So it was a good thing that I landed the first time down, because there wasn't enough fuel to even get halfway around. We'd go to the tactical range out west of down. It was actually close to Yuma, Arizona, but it was out of Tucson, and it was great because we would carry a great big fuel tank on each side, simulating dropping and delivering napalm, and then you had bombs that were full of concrete, so they'd simulate 500 pounds. So when you took off, you were 39,000 pounds, which is the fastest tricycle in the world, but not a real great flying machine. And there were runways and airplanes and tunnels and all sorts of targets out there. And you didn't have an opportunity ever to really, I mean, this was practice, but you hadn't ever practiced it before. So when you'd go down and you'd deliver napalm from 50 feet, and it'll make a scorch of the earth about 200 feet long, and without the fire, it's still pretty impressive just with water. And the bombs, you know, when you see a 500-pound hunk of concrete hit the ground, it makes a dent in it. And that was particularly fun. But one of the things that I will never forget, it's indelibly etched in my mind, is I was an F model with a major that was a part-timer. That he was, you know, listed as an instructor, but he really probably wasn't. And he's sitting in the back seat, and we had a hung bomb. And for a hung bomb, you had to go past the tower at Yuma, because if you legitimately had a hung bomb, you had to land there. And Arizona is just beastly hot in the summer all the time. That's why we would start flying at 4 in the morning and quit at noon. So we go down to the Yuma Tower. We're probably 35 feet, and they look at it with their binoculars. And they said, "Oh, it looks like it's secured, so you're okay to go back." Well, that was fine. We were okay to go back, but that airplane would not climb. So we're just driving out over the mountain. We probably went 10 miles. You go up 5 feet and then a little bit more and a little bit more. And it took us forever, what seemed like forever. We're driving by big saguaro cactuses and junk growing out in the desert. We could not get that airplane back in the air. And that's just the way it performed in hot weather. You know, we had 2 people drive one off the end of the runway. It's 2 miles long, never got in the air. Burned up and looked like a skeleton. We were able to nurse it back up. And the frustration was, if you could go to afterburner and go from 10,000 to 16,000 pounds of thrust, but when you lit the afterburner, if it didn't light, all of a sudden you had opened up your exhaust, and you'd lose a third of what your 10,000 pounds was. So you were pretty well scorched. Yeah, we made it back.
It's tradition in our family to go on a horseback ride. We've done it on practically every Black Hills vacation. It always brings back memories of my childhood. I had a good friend, Marcia Holmes, who lived on the edge of Beersford. And the farmer that had horses next to their house said that Marcia could ride those horses whenever she wanted to, which was wonderful because she and I just loved all the cowgirl stuff. She had invited me to come over. We didn't know how to put saddles on, but she knew how to get the bridles on. And she taught me how to get on the horse. The horses were riding horses, really pretty, and she led them over by a fence, and we climbed up on holding the reins, we climbed up on the fence and got on the bare back of the horses. And then she said I could figure it out. She told me how to stop the horse and how to neck rein. And then she said, you'll just have to do it to learn how. Well, of course, the horse knew I knew nothing about it, and he took off like a shot across the field, and all I could do was hang on to the mane so I wouldn't fall off. And I held on for quite a while, and then, well, he thought of another way to get me off would be to go over by the trees. And Marcia is trying to yell me instructions, but the horse is doing exactly as it pleased. So it goes through the trees, thinking maybe he'd knock me off that way. And then he took off again, and I was getting so tired that I finally just fell off. And I hurt my arm, but I knew it wasn't broken. I think I was probably in about the 6th grade. And she said, Karen, you have to get back on that horse, because if you don't, you'll never ride again. And I thought she knew what she was talking about. So I climbed back up, and somehow the horse, I jerked around a lot harder than I did to begin with, and he controlled himself a little better. So that was a wonderful experience. I've loved horses my whole life. We lived in Huron, South Dakota, when Kyle and Carrie were going through school. They graduated from high school there. So in the 80s, we would always go to the state fair, and the barns that I loved best to visit were the horses. I could just go and stare at them and think, oh, they're so beautiful. Their eyes are gorgeous. And that's one of my favorite things that we did on this vacation, this celebration.
On one of our vacations with the Liebel family, we signed up for a horseback ride to go up to the top of Harney Peak, which I don't even know if they'll let you do anymore, but Harney Peak, now called Black Elk Mountain, is the highest peak between the Rockies and the Pyrenees. So it's a great adventure. We all got assigned our horses, and Angie, who was the smallest, got a horse about must have been 20 hands tall, well, at least 15. Huge horse, and she was scared to death and crying like never before. And Jim took her behind the barn and said, "We are going horseback riding. You're going to enjoy it. Now get on that horse." She did. And I don't know if she's ever gone on another horseback ride, but we had a great trip up to Harney Peak, which is not an easy trail whether you're walking or riding a horse. And on the way back, as I recall, we got a little bit of hail and a little bit of rain, which is pretty typical for the Black Hills. But we had a tremendous adventure and created a great memory seared into everyone's mind.
On another vacation in the hills, it might have even been a bank convention, and we stayed in Spearfish, and holding on to tradition, we thought we should do horseback riding. So we got to go in the morning and had a great ride, and we had so much fun on that. Somebody suggested that we could go, there was also an evening ride that you could go on. And on that ride, we actually went up into the mountains, and the guide took us about halfway down the trail. There was a mountain lion den, and we got to get off of our horses and actually walk right inside, which was very cool. By that time it was starting to get dark, and the trail, we must have been at a pretty good elevation, and the trail going back to the ranch, the guide said, "Now if anybody would like to gallop on your horse, I'll let you do it on this ride. So those that didn't want to do that got toward the back of the line. And we are actually on a mountainside, and you can look down into the valley on the right side. But I thought, when am I ever going to get a chance to gallop a horse this great, this, with following what you would want him to do? So I gave my horse a big kick, and now it is galloping along this mountain trail, passing other horses. And I can't see, I can't even quite imagine how he's keeping his footing, staying on the trail, and I don't even know exactly where we're going. But I think he won the race. That was a mountaintop experience.
Well, I was born in the year of the dog, but I didn't know it. And when I could start remembering things, I remember going to card parties that were illuminated by kerosene lanterns, and it seemed like everybody smoked. There was just a din of not much light and a lot of smoke and a lot of cards and a lot of laughing and a lot of having a good time, but nobody had any money. And so everybody was pretty equal in that way. But then a revolution occurred when I was 5 years old. We got electricity. The Rural Electrification Association came through, and we actually could have a toaster and made toast. And we had electric lights, and we had a yard light so you could see at night. The house that we lived in was built in 1917, and of course did not have anything prepared for electrical lighting in 1951. So when we were putting the light in the kitchen, the electrician that we had hired to do the job could not fit into the space above the kitchen. So at 5 years old, he asked if I could go in there and put the wires in, which I did. And I guess that was probably the end of my electrical experience, but it got a fixture into the kitchen, and that was, if we had one fixture in each room, that was like more than enough. So we had electric lights then. And then my sister, Gloria, 8 years older than me, and of course we did not have the convenience of indoor plumbing, so she was responsible for me a lot of the time, and she would take me to the outdoor toilet and set me on the toilet, and I couldn't get down by myself, so I would sit there for sometimes an hour and look at magazines and the Sears Roebuck catalog and whatever else there was for reading material until you needed it for toilet paper. And I guess that's probably formed a lifetime bad habit of staying in the bathroom to read. But it worked out all right because I was able to go to grade school then, in a country school that had 12 students. We had all 8 grades, so they'd group them together in the first and second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth. And that was a huge advantage for me because I was always allowed to go up a grade, and it was great preparation for high school and college. And I think it's a heritage that you can't duplicate and you can't get anymore, is going to a country school where you have one teacher teaching all 8 grades and every subject you ever imagined. When I was 4 years old, Dad traded off his gas-guzzling Ford for a 1950 Chevrolet two-door with manual transmission. And of course, in those days, you had to put road miles on it. So Arnie and Alice Mackey and Gloria and I and Mom and Dad headed out to the Black Hills for what was called a vacation. And we went especially to see Mount Rushmore, which was and is a fantastic memorial sculpted by Gutzen Borglum, who is a Danish person. And the other things that we did, I mean, I don't remember even where we parked or anything, but Mount Rushmore was you kind of went and you looked at it and then you left. And today, my goodness, after $12.5 million, we have parking and a big plaza and food and ice cream and tea and everything. But the four presidents are still up there in exactly the same way that they were, with mountain goats and big orange sheep walking around in the rubble below them. So it's a fantastic monument. The other things we did on that trip, because Arnie had a relative that worked in a mine at Homestake, which at that time was the most productive gold mine in the world. So we stayed in Deadwood. There was no such thing as a motel anywhere. We had to stay with relatives, and we didn't have, of course, all the offerings that we have now. But we had a vacation, one of two that I can remember before I was 18 years old.
We all enjoyed going on the 1880 train, and I think back to the time that my brother and I used to stay with our grandparents, Grandpa and Grandma Liebel, in Emery, South Dakota. And my dad's sister, so my Aunt Mill, was married to Hit Mayer. And he is still living at 90 years, more than 90 years old now, in Mitchell, South Dakota. When they were young, Hit worked at the train depot in Emery, and he was the guy that telegraphed signals to stations, I imagine, and using the Morse code. The person who should tell about all of these trains and size of tracks and engines would be Bob Schultz, our good friend. He would love to tell all of his train stories. He's in a club that does train setups at Christmas time, and that's one of the things that Morgan loves to do every Christmas is visit the train exhibit at the fairgrounds. And at one time I traveled by train, but it's been so long ago. It must have been early grade school, and I imagine that my brother and I probably rode on one of the last passenger trains in South Dakota. We went, I believe, from Emery to Salem, and Salem was the town that my great-grandma Pink, who you've already heard about, lived. And we would stay there for some time in the summers. And I recollect when we lived in Beersford in the first few years, we lived next door to a train track. And I have vivid memories of trains going through with their kind of forlorn, wailing whistle, and I would wonder where they're going. Maybe that's why I still like trains.
My uncle Leroy was drafted into the Army in World War II, and when he had finished his training and was going overseas, and he ended up in Maastricht or in the Love area of Belgium, in that neighborhood. But anyway, my Uncle Carl and Dad were going to go and see him before he shipped out, and they rode the train, I believe, from Arlington to either Omaha or Kansas City. And for the next, as long as I can remember, years, Dad always said that a train has square wheels. He just hated riding on it. It was the roughest ride he had ever had going anywhere. So there was never any desire on my part to ride a train. But when I was 12 years old, my Uncle Carl moved to Waterloo, Iowa, and worked as a janitor in a school there. And Ursel, his wife, also worked at the school. And even though I was 12, I was just waiting there for my Uncle Willie to come by and pick me up after, I don't know, a week or something. So I started. I slept on a sofa there, and the train went by. And in the morning, my head was at the other end of the sofa. So I think the train bothered me somewhat. But during the day, I didn't have anything really to do. And so when the mailman came by, I started talking to the mailman. I started walking with the mailman, and I walked with him for several hours. And pretty soon his route was done. He says, "Oh, goodbye," and he went home. And I had no idea where I was in Waterloo, Iowa. So I wandered around and until I could remember seeing some of the houses, which was Kyle's secret to his paper route. And eventually I found brick places, and I got myself back to Carl and Ursul's apartment that they lived in Waterloo. But I never wanted to follow a mailman again because they just dump you at the end of the route. And I didn't have any idea where I was at, and I still wouldn't. The train came to Arlington in 1901, and unbeknownst to me, changed my life forever because the Laketon Post Office, which was located for about 12 years in the Laketon area and was most at that time on the north quarter that we always called Aaronson's, which is next to the highest point in Brookings County. That right below it, Bryce found two axe heads that were deemed to be between 5,000 and 6,000 years old and had come from northwestern Iowa because they're 3/4 rounded and 1/4 square. So Antelope Hill is a favorite spot for the history, right? And it also is used by the Geological Survey when they did the project at Lake Poncet that put in a sewer system for them. So the train played a role in the development of that area, and of course it was critical in shipping grain so that there was some kind of a market for it as well as livestock. So yeah, Bob would be the one to tell because the 1880 train was a narrow gauge train and shared a track with the Burlington Northern, which is a wide gauge or regular gauge train. So there was a track running down the middle so that they could go on that narrow gauge. But today they're still running a steam engine that Bob knows all the details on, and we went not behind the diesel, which goes early in the morning, but behind the steam engine. And we learned that we want to sit further back than the first open car because when they go up the hill, and it is one of the steeper adhesion railroads, they put sand in it to clean out the boiler. And speaking of steep adhesion railroads reminds me of the train trip we actually went on in Norway with Gloria and Jean from Flom to Myrdal, which is the steepest adhesion railroad in the world. And there were places, even though the train was short, where we could see the train in 3 different places. And then it stopped, and some lady came out of the water and sang, and we went on. We ended up at Myrdal, which was just a whistle stop for the regular train that we rode on, and we rode the train the rest of the way back to Oslo. It was another great memory that we had. It was a fantastic trip. About 12 miles south of Hot Springs in the Mammoth site, there's a wild horse sanctuary that is the result of a man by the name of Dayton Hyde, who grew up in Michigan, but his uncle had a ranch in Oregon and wrote him a letter about his cowboys having caught a bunch of wild horses. So he went out there and he loved the wild horses. But when he came back from fighting in World War II, there were no wild horses around. And in 1986, he was driving through Nevada and saw a huge pen of wild horses that appeared to be well fed, but they were completely enclosed and not able to run free. So he took on that idea with a passion. The Bureau of Land Management was rounding up wild horses and putting them in enclosures until they died. He was able to buy about 7,000 acres in South Dakota, and I believe Governor Mickelson got another 6,000 or 7,000 acres together for him. And they now have this 13 or 14,000 acre place where horses are free to run wild, just as they did years and years and years ago. Horses actually are native to North America, and they were used by the Native Americans. They were used by cowboys. Their horses have been an integral part of the development of North America. So the Wild Horse Sanctuary has about 600 of them, and they have a fairly old bus that they took us out to see the horses in, and we stopped at a few places, one of the most interesting being where there were petroglyphs from Native American days as well as early cowboy days, and our guide pointed out that the cowboys that were tending cattle there and scratching on this stone at the time of the outbreak of a world war wouldn't have known about that war for probably 6 months after that, or they wouldn't have known about Pearl Harbor until 6 months after it occurred. And there also is a lot of cliff swallows that inhabit that area. But it was incredibly interesting, and there's a cave there that they claim no one has gone into, but it had to have been used when, at least when the cowboys were there. And they have a small place that they kept some oats to feed their horses so that they wouldn't just wander away. One of the most interesting things to me, well, there were a couple, but one of the most interesting things really was that they do not ever mix trained horses with the wild. Even the cowboys that work the couple thousand acres that they ranch there don't ride horses because they don't mix and they don't get along well together. The other thing we saw that I had never seen before were what they called the Spanish Mustangs that have stripes like zebras on their front legs, and they had a herd of about 50 or 60 of them. That was a pretty interesting part of the of the whole 600 and some head. You could buy one for $500, and they'll hire somebody to gentle it for more than that, and then you have your horse. I thought they were beautiful. It was a highlight for me to see that someone's dream, and he's still there, 93 years old, Dayton Hyde, has given these horses the opportunity to run free for the rest of their lives, and it was pretty incredible. The road was rough, but worth the trip. In 1970, the Air Defense Command operational aircraft that we had in Sioux Falls was the F-102, which was a single-seat supersonic missile and rocket plane, and it was great fun to fly. But in order to be certified qualified, you had to finish survival training, and that consisted of parasailing and simulation of coming out of an ejection seat and the opening shock of a parachute. So they put us on a rail that was real steep in a seat, and they hooked you to a wire that was attached to your parachute harness. And it was important that you have that harness on right, because the seat would come down to the edge and you'd go tumbling out of there, and then you would fall until the wire stopped your fall, and you found out if you had your harness in the right place. And now, instead of getting paid to do that, you have to pay, and they call it zip lining.
Lee and I decided not to go on the zip line, and that may be because early in our marriage, when we were in pilot training, I had an experience that might have prevented my enthusiasm for jumping and sliding. After his training in the T-33 plane, T-37, we had a special event for the wives. It was called Red Carpet Day. It was a very special day to kind of celebrate that the men had passed the first third of their training. And I was at the stage in my life that I cared quite a bit about how people perceived me. And this is a story that will show you that I got over that pretty quickly. We viewed the T-37, and the officer who was guiding us, the group of wives, asked, "Does anyone want to get in the cockpit and see what it feels like and look at the instruments?" And I thought, oh, I'm not going to get an opportunity to do something like that. So I climbed right up and sat in the cockpit and thought, this looks very complicated. And I had on that day a pair of slacks that were a little bit tight, and I thought, ooh, I don't really want to back down and go on the ladder again. What if my pants rip? So I decided that I'd just go on the other side and jump down from the wing and to the ground. It wasn't that far. I was young, pretty able to do things like that. So I get off onto the wing, and I'm ready to jump, and I have a jacket on that has a hood on it. And as I jump, the hood catches on the hook of the canopy, and I'm hanging there in front of the whole group, thinking this might be the end of me. But luckily, the hood ripped off and I fell to the ground. Wasn't hurt, but I was pretty embarrassed. So I don't think I'll do any zip lining or anything like that for a long time.